Distinguished speakers, dear participants and colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second panel titled Hindered Access to Rights from a Gender Perspective. My name is Nadja Schuster. I work with the VIDC, the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, on gender justice, human trafficking, and migration and development. Before introducing the topic to you, I would like to say a few words about the VIDC and our cooperation partners. The VIDC acts as a think tank and agent for social and political change through public education and awareness raising. In our conferences and campaigns, we tackle international politics, human rights violations, gender inequalities, development and tax policies, as well as racism in football. In addition, our work benefits from a long-standing cooperation with migrant and diaspora communities living in Vienna, particularly from Afghanistan, Turkey, and different African countries. This year, ladies and gentlemen, it's the 7th year the VIDC is co-organizing this conference together with the Austrian task force. And since 2016, the OECD is another important cooperation partner. For this panel and two workshops, workshop 1 and 2, we have cooperated with the Austrian branch of the International Organization for Migration. Many thanks to Katie Klaffenberg, I don't see her right now, and Oana Timofta for the very fruitful cooperation. At this point, I would also like to thank all our cooperation partners, especially the Austrian task force, the ministries, different ministries, and in particular also the interpreters for interpretation of this conference. The fight against human trafficking is being carried out between the two poles of security policy and human rights. In different European countries, the prevailing political discourse on securitization has led to the framing of human trafficking as a security issue. Securitization is justified because something of value is being threatened at its core and must therefore be protected. For example, migrants and refugees are often portrayed as a threat to state sovereignty. In short, by labeling something as a security issue, it is dramatized as an issue of supreme priority that needs to be dealt with urgency and that legitimates the bypassing of democratic procedures. As a result, restrictive political measures against migrants and refugees are introduced. This means that the security doctrine may lead to the criminalization of victims, as they might be categorized as illegal and thereby be deprived of protection and of their access to rights. I was very pleased that Ms. Giamarinaro put emphasis on the failure of the criminal justice system to identify trafficking victims in her very powerful speech. I think it cannot be stressed strongly enough that assistance and support for victims or suspected victims should be unconditional and not depend on the asylum status nor on the capacity of the affected people to cooperate with law enforcement agencies. From a human rights and a gender perspective, and here I'm referring to states' responsibilities and obligations, from a human rights and a gender perspective, we have to ask whose security is perceived as being worthy of protection? Who is a victim? Who is a perpetrator? And what is the impact of securitization on the enforcement of human rights, women's rights, children's rights, victims' rights in general? So in the following panel, we will discuss the access to rights of trafficked persons and those who are vulnerable to trafficking from a gender perspective. And therefore, we will rely on the expertise and long-term and multidisciplinary expertise of our distinguished guests. It's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Bärbel Heide-Uhl. She's a political scientist and independent researcher. In her book, Die Sicherheit der Menschenrechte, The Security of Human Rights, She analyzes the fight against human trafficking between the opposing paradigms of the politics of security and the protection of human rights. When I discovered her book, I thought she would be the perfect keynote speaker for today's focus, and here she is. After a critical political science reflection on the institutionalization of the anti-trafficking discourse, we will take a closer look at two European countries, Germany and Greece. Our next speaker, Corinna Chatziноcolou, I hope I pronounced it quite right. She will talk about the challenges Greece is confronted with, especially when taking the high numbers of arrivals of refugees into account. She will give us an insight on how vulnerable at-risk groups, particularly children and unaccompanied minors, are identified. Corinna is a high-level expert and researcher on child trafficking, and she advises the Greek National Rapporteur. Last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Luisa Lupascu from the German Trade Union Federation. She will tell us more about the role of trade unions in combating human trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation and forced labor. She will also dwell on the impact on the new criminal law that has been introduced in Germany on identifying and protecting victims in different labor sectors. A very warm welcome to all of you. Many thanks that you will enrich this conference. I think they deserve an applause. Before I will hand over to Helmut Sachs, the chair of this panel, I'd like to introduce him. Helmut is a member of the group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings of the Council of Europe, already since 2010. He is a key researcher at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Human Rights in Vienna. Helmut has sound academic expertise coupled with an extensive human rights background. Currently, he is involved in the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty. He has worked for several years on the establishment of national referral mechanisms and child rights-based approaches. Through his 8 years as a member of GRETA, he is well experienced in monitoring governmental anti-trafficking and interventions and in collaborating with non-governmental networks. Helmut is also a member of the working group on child trafficking of the Austrian task force, and he has published extensively on child rights, most recently in the Routledge Handbook on Human Trafficking, which was co-edited by Bärbel Heide-Ulm. Many thanks for your attention. Now I would like to hand over to Helmut. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadja, for the very kind opening remarks and introduction already. A late good morning to everyone. Thank you for staying with us. It's a quite dense, intensive morning of this anti-trafficking event. This is the panel, and as I've been introduced, Helmut Sachs, so I will chair this meeting as a moderator, trying to both provide an opportunity for the panelists to share their views and expertise with you, but also at some stage then to give you a voice as distinguished participants of the event to have some nice interactive discussion. Thank you also to VIDC and IOM for organizing this panel, which addresses specifically the gender dimension of trafficking and of trafficking responses in terms of access to justice for victims of trafficking. To some extent, we heard of some experiences, and we got already some recommendations from the previous panel, from the UN Special Rapporteur, addressing already aspects of gender. Still, for this kind of basic introductory comments, I would just like to highlight the dimensions again, because Nadja has mentioned the importance of framing the narratives which exist about trafficking and the various purposes, what should be or is often considered to be a victim of trafficking, what would be appropriate responses in the context of migration discourse, securitization, etc. But the same applies also to the gender dimension. Also from our GRETA experience, we have come across many stakeholders in many countries who still consider trafficking as something related to women, to the sexual exploitation of women. But, and to some extent, of course, this is clearly true, which was also mentioned in the previous panel, that when it comes to sexual exploitation, this recent report from the European Institute for Gender Equality has once again confirmed that the overwhelming majority of victims is women. At the same time, trafficking is much broader in various aspects. In terms of the exploitative purposes, it goes to labor exploitation, which has been mentioned. There's exploitation through pressure on persons to commit offenses. There is exploitation through begging of various groups. And then there is also another aspect related to the gender dimension. We also have to think of the situation of men, of male victims of trafficking. For example, and this is a well-established fact by data coming from the UN, from IOM, from the European side, including also from GRETA, that there's an increasing identification, not just a concern, but also identification of male victims of trafficking. And there is increasing concern for labor exploitation in that context. And if we then dig deeper in terms of the gender dimensions, we will realize that also men are exploited sexually, that women are also exploited economically. Thinking about the care sector, for example, domestic work has been mentioned already. So it's really a complex picture, and perhaps just to make it complete, because that's also my personal kind of particular interest, not to forget about the situation of children in that context as victims of trafficking, both in terms of the numbers we are talking about and also of the quality. Because I found it quite striking in 2015, Eurostat reported that around 14% of identified victims at that time have been children, which doesn't look quite a large number. But if you would just add the next age group between 18 and 24, then you would add some 36%, making actually children and young people up to the age of 24, a majority of all trafficking victims identified in the European Union. So just to give you the picture of the dimensions. And then, of course, there's also the quality element. Children are not just adults, they need specific ways of engagement. You need to have specific mechanisms to identify them, to refer them. So, and there again, you have a gender dimension to it. To what extent are girls affected by exploitative means, by violence, gender-based violence? To what extent, or what is the situation of boys being exploited also sexually, for example? And just as a final remark, from our GRETA perspective, for many years now, we have noted the lack of sensitivity, the lack of specialization, and also the lack of political will to fully address the gender dimension of trafficking throughout our reports. If you think of policy responses which are primarily still directed to one type of exploitation, not following a comprehensive approach. If you think of responses, the availability of shelter for men, for boys, you would realize that there are several deficits, and in particular also in the migration context, about all the different aspects of gender-based violence in that context. So it is based on that experience from our first 8 years of evaluation rounds, that GRETA has decided this year that for the third round, for the coming 4 years, we will have a specific focus on access to justice for victims, access to remedies, to really address this victim-centered human rights-based approach of the Anti-Trafficking Convention, and include also in this, of course, gender sensitivity in all our monitoring efforts. So this was just an effort to kind of frame the further discussion in our panel. I think I've said enough. I would just now like to hand over to Bervel for your keynote presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies and colleagues from the civil society, maybe also academics. I'm very happy to be here and back in the Hofburg again, and I'm also happy to see quite some familiar faces from previous cooperations, and I'm most of all very thankful to the organizers to giving me the opportunity to participate in this very interesting event. I would like to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that was already mentioned by Nadja, about the securitization, or what I call the securitization of human rights and the connection to anti-trafficking policies. In 1943, Hannah Arendt wrote in her essay, "We refugees," I quote, "with us persecuted Jews who then became stateless people. The meaning of the term refugee changed significantly. The term refugee had almost a sound of veneration and respect. However, it now triggers the notion of something very suspicious and very unfortunate at the same time." End of quote. These words sound to us in the current context depressingly familiar. The perception of refugees nowadays in Europe as suspicious and unfortunate is predominant in the political discourse. More and more political leaders in Europe create a context in which the understanding of a refugee as suspicious even prevails over the unfortunate. For instance, the Czech President Zeman regularly refers to refugees as terrorists. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban calls refugees invaders. The head of the German Bundesland Bavaria, Söder, urges that rejected asylum seekers have to be, I quote, "quickly deported in a concentrated manner," end of quote. And the Austrian Chancellor Kurz raised his critique over NGO actors who saved the lives of thousands of people, men, women, children, from drowning in the Mediterranean Sea as, I quote, "collaborators with criminal smugglers," end of quote. Words matter and have consequences. They normalize slowly the breach of international law and raise the acceptance of establishing yet more restrictive measures for migrants and refugees, including surveillance and violation of privacy rights, high-speed or summary asylum procedures, and placing asylum seekers in close detention facilities throughout Europe. Even though the attempt to disqualify individuals as being suspicious or to take away their agency in calling them unfortunate ignores the fact that international law guarantees the right to seek asylum. States do have an obligation to consider their claims no matter how people are being disqualified and categorized in the public discourse. This strategy to regularly refer to migrants and refugees as an immediate threat to our societies that is too risky to be covered by the existing security responses and needs therefore even more new procedures, laws and institutions is called in political science the securitization strategy. Securitization means a speech act to manifest a state of alert and to calls for exceptional measures. A securitization strategy, according to the Copenhagen School of Security, who actually developed this concept, does not necessarily have to be based on factual incidents. It needs mainly an authority that claims a state of alert and an audience who believes this authority. A good illustration for a securitization strategy was a couple of months ago, the EU Council conclusion on migration adopted on 28th of June in this year. Even though the document deals, among others, with migration, it does not contain the word migrant nor refugee. Instead, it refers to people to escape hardship, including armed conflicts, as, I quote, flows, or uncontrolled flows, or migratory flows, or detected illegal border crossing. This dehumanized language suggests that we do not talk about people, but about natural disasters. Hannah Arendt's framing of suspicious and unfortunate referred to refugees. However, and now I come to anti-trafficking in case you were wondering. However, it is not an unfamiliar expression also in anti-trafficking policies. Neither is the securitization strategy. Anti-trafficking strategies also embrace the logic of security politics while maintaining at the same time a high level of human rights rhetorics. The Palermo Protocol, as the first international legal definition of human trafficking, is part of the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime and suggests that human trafficking has to be treated as part of a larger security politics strategy. Even if the protocol does not suggest that human trafficking cases have to be perpetrated by an organized group in order to fall under the definition of human trafficking, and in fact, if we look at the federal police statistics in Germany, the majority of the investigated cases of human trafficking are not committed by transnational organized groups. The term transnational organized crime still remains the predominant pattern in our contemporary conversation about human trafficking and supports the idea of trafficked persons as a high-risk group in need for high security facilities and regimes. The philosopher Claudia Aradao, who's professor at the London University, created the formula of an anti-trafficking policies as the, I quote, politics of risk and pity. According to her analysis, the anti-trafficking framework adopted all the measures of contemporary restriction of migration and infuses them with its inherent human rights rhetoric. As she said, I quote, instead of deportation, it is now called an anti-trafficking framework, voluntary return. Instead of detention center, it's called an anti-trafficking framework, rehabilitation centers or shelters. And instead of irregular migrants, it's called victims. The politics of risk and pity can be regarded as the securitization of human rights, as I frame it, to use security measures on the individual to protect her or his human right. And now I give you 3 examples from the anti-trafficking policies, and some of them already were mentioned by the UN rapporteur, Maria Grazia Giammarinaro in the morning. First example is what I called a human rights-based detention. The victim of trafficking is perceived as too traumatized to come forward to claim his or her rights. Therefore, the trafficked person has to be identified by competent authorities and referred to a shelter that is often called a closed-type shelter to protect her or him from the possible retaliation by the traffickers, at least so goes the narrative. The disadvantage for the trafficked person in this scenario is that she or he loses their right to freedom of movement and also loses their right to be protected against arbitrary detention. But it is, of course, for her or his own safety. Second example, it's the profiling of victims instead of profiling of perpetrators, which is a core element in anti-trafficking policies. Anti-trafficking data collection tools are mainly based on the identification of victims by authorities rather than as a criminological framework would suggest, the identification of perpetrators. This is in stark contrast to other criminal narratives, including, for example, anti-terrorism measures that focus solely on potential and suspected perpetrators as the driving force of the crime. The victim of trafficking is at the core of global datafication that leads to surveillance techniques of marginalized populations and a violation of privacy rights of victims of trafficking. Often also prior to the crime, they are registered, their personal data are being stored, and also in the framework of transnational referral mechanism, the personal data of presumed victims are even transferred cross-border. My third example and last, there's a group ranking exercise, identification of trafficked persons in, quotation, in mixed migration flows. The securitization approach during the contemporary refugee crisis in Europe and beyond, which actually is not a refugee crisis, but a crisis of reception and a crisis of rule of law, leads governments to establish new procedures like the EU-Turkey agreement that implies closed reception facilities in Greece, returning people who fled to Greece back to Turkey, and resettlement programs of Syrians from Turkey to the EU territory. We witnessed in that last years multiple failures of public infrastructure to comply with the rights of asylum seekers and other migrants. Refugees are forced to live in camps with no sufficient access to water, electricity, and other essential means of subsistence. And also, it is reported recently that even children try to commit suicide and women do not want to visit the bathrooms anymore because they are afraid of being raped. Nevertheless, there's a pretension by the international community to, I quote, identify and protect human trafficking victims in mixed migration flows. It is difficult to find a strategy for identification of trafficked persons and to enable individual claims for international protection when the same actors, which are the governments, are failing at the same time to provide those people with basic human needs and supplies. It seems that human rights protection in practice implies nowadays group ranking exercise with fatal consequences for individuals being them victims of trafficking or asylum seekers or both. I would like to conclude. The concepts of security politics and human rights are considered in the political discourse as competing against each other. As I tried to illustrate, they can form a strategic interconnected alliance that I call the securitization of human rights. But how can we desecuritize these strategies? And I can only second what Maria Grazia Giammarinaro said before. We should take human rights seriously. A possible way out of the securitization of human rights, and I quote Hannah Arendt again, and her postulate of the right to have rights. The right to have rights, according to Arendt, is her critique of human rights, which is often misunderstood because often it is used as a synonym for human rights. No, it is a critique of human rights, of the human rights idea as being useless for the millions of stateless people in Europe, including Arendt, before, during, and after the Second World War. The right to have rights demand that each individual has the right to membership and to belong to a political community that allows him or her access to claim rights. We have to go back to an understanding of human rights that protects the individual against governmental and societal premature categorization and disqualification. We need to establish procedure so that every individual can speak up. I conclude with a quotation of the very visionary media theorist Cornelia Wisman, who actually gave us a formula of human rights that I think it's very helpful for our daily work. I quote, "The human being, the gap in the law that declares him or herself by speaking up Defining the human being, which is not a legal term for good reason, a human being is not a legal term for good reason, is therefore part of a discourse-generating project of human rights. The human being has almost a mathematical function by taking on all names that are given to him or her. Human rights are like a discursive filter transcending all imaginations, versions and images of a human being. He or she can be everyone and everything in his or her articulation. The individual or the collective, biologically defined species, or in his or her attribute to form a nation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bärbel, for this really thought-provoking keynote presentation statement. I would just like to pose an immediate follow-up question to you, because as you have described the securitization of the human rights, of the trafficking discourse, I just wonder, the question could be security for whom? There could also be a discussion about the security of victims, actually, and especially from a gender perspective, as you mentioned, the difficult situation of women in reception centers, etc. From your perspective, what would be the reasons why this has actually shifted to this kind of national security discourse away from security, safety of victims of trafficking?
I think it's on, yes. There was a decade ago, there was this concept of human security, which actually a little bit got lost. It didn't occur to me in the literature recently.
Sorry, I'm not sure. Can you hear this?
No.
Is it on?
I think it's, can you hear me now? Can I have yours? Okay. A decade ago, there was this concept flowing around in the literature, but also in NGO project that was called human security, that actually looked at from a human rights perspective and in a very constructive way to adopt the idea of security to each individual. Unfortunately, that concept of human security became a little bit out of fashion. I don't see it anymore floating around either in practice nor in the theoretical literature. However, the securitization is totally different, actually an opposement or opposing strategy from the human security. And it in terms of anti-trafficking, and this I really think Claudia Aradau put it to the point, it's the politics of risk and pity, and this is why the risk is the securitization and the security narrative, but the pity is also very important because it puts people into a place where he or she has no agency. And this you see in so many literature about anti-trafficking work, it's that people are being claimed, oh, they're so traumatized to come forward. They cannot claim their own rights. We have to do that for them. We have to identify them. And this is actually also highly problematic.
Thank you. Well, this was just as an immediate follow-up, because not to completely jeopardize our time schedule, I would like now just to ask Corinna Nicolaou from the Greek National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings for her statement, which will deal also on the migration situation, the impact it has on trafficking discourse in Greece, and including also addressing the gender dimension to it. Thank you, Corinna.
Thank you, Helmut. I would like to thank all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to exchange experiences here with you, especially the VIDC and IOM for organizing this panel. I will try to offer a view on how the migration management actually affected systemically Greece and the development of anti-trafficking policies in this context. Yeah? In that way, I think I would somehow add to what Barbara said. Actually, one of the first sentences in our new National Action Plan includes the term human security. And thank you for bringing that up. I would like quickly, you know, sometimes you prepare something, but then something else comes up. So I would like to make a couple of statements before I start. First of all, we all know that social inequalities actually create vulnerabilities. And then when there is vulnerability, it's easier to be exploited. It doesn't mean that you're going to be exploited, to respond to previous comment, but there is an increased likelihood to be exploited. Now, exploitation, I think, is a form of exercising power on someone else in order to gain profit from this someone else. The unequal distribution of power is reflected upon the structural basis of our states, I think, as well as upon the everyday of our societies. For example, most of the law enforcement personnel are men. Most politicians are men. These people will actually go out to the field and try to support victims of trafficking. Most victims of trafficking are women. Again, we see that there is an uneven distribution of power, and it's like making the circle again and again. It's like certifying that the distribution of power that we have already achieved, it's the same, it's going to remain the same, and now I'm the one to save you, yeah? And you see me again in front of you, but then we need victims to have THB. And in order to have these victims, we have to listen to them, to really understand their needs, to know more about them, to go outside of the field and speak with them. So why all this? In order to actually allow them to rebuild trust to somebody. So how are they going to build trust to somebody if, when we go outside of the field, we bring with us all these structural inequalities that they have put them in that place? So I just need to share these thoughts with an expert audience as you are, so then you know that I hope to have your precious feedback at the end. So going back to my talk, since 1980s, Greece has been receiving a considerable number of migrants. In 2010, the mixed migration flows started gradually to increase to reach a record number in 2015, 850,000 people in a year. I was doing trainings at the time with professionals at the islands. So I was speaking with Coast Guards, I remember a day. So a guy came at the end of the training, he said, "Madam, you know what? After 16 hours in the water, even if my mom would be inside the water, I wouldn't be able to say." And you asked me to be able to identify a victim of trafficking during the time of rescue. Up to today, the number of migrants and refugees arriving to Greece remains high. From January to today, 30,000 people were registered at the first reception and identification centers. The 5 RICs, I will be referring to the first reception and identification centers as RICs, are currently over capacity. This is also the situation at the accommodation structures situated at the mainland. Now, the large mixed migration flows increased in a very short period of time, the number of extremely vulnerable individuals residing in Greece. According to data from the Ministry of Health, in 2018, nearly 50% of the migrants and asylum seekers registered at the RICs have been evaluated by the medical and psychosocial units as vulnerable. Not all of them are victims of trafficking. We have victims of torture, we have people with chronic diseases, we have women traveling alone with kids, we have pregnant women, but nearly 50% of the 30,000 people who have arrived this year only in Greece have been evaluated by our medical and psychosocial units as vulnerable. Consequently, the Greek state had to create from scratch sometimes accommodation structures and services to receive such large numbers of vulnerable people. It was also necessary to employ and quickly train new personnel for key services such as the police, border police, first reception services, asylum service, psychology units, etc. At the same time, the state had to develop gender and age-sensitive reception conditions and to ensure human rights to all newcomers. We have signed and ratified all the conventions that you have done as well, and we really want to keep the standards high. I have personally participated in this process as a field worker, an academic, a senior researcher, and a policymaker, and I assure you that all involved actors did and are still doing their best. But still, it is not enough. The number of people overwhelms us. A European solution is needed to effectively manage such intense migratory flows. Despite the adversities, here are some measures that were implemented quickly to respond to the situation. RICs were created in 5 islands, which can host around 6,000 people. Today, only in Moria, the number of people is larger than that. We have employed and trained new personnel, yet they are not enough. They get the minimum wage, they often work over hours, and they suffer from burnout. For this reason, many professionals quit from frontline posts after some months of service, and then we have to employ new people, train them again and again and again and again. The Greek state had to constantly review and update the regulations referring to RICs as the involved actors kept changing, including European agencies, international organizations, national and international NGOs, and state agencies. In each RIC from the 5 islands, you will find a different combination of the above-mentioned actors. So you had to review the regulations for each RIC separately. Today, hopefully, things are more stable and the coordination among agencies much easier. It is clear that in 2015, all efforts were directed towards managing the large migratory flows. Everybody was speaking about combating human smuggling at the time and ensuring state security at both national and European level. Also, on the field, anti-trafficking measures were not the priority. The priority was rescuing people in danger. I told you that we received 850,000 people only in 2015. At the same time, there was a growing concern not to admit any links between human smuggling and human trafficking. The securitization of Europe was being built up. The Office of the National Rapporteur had recognized since 2015 the strong links between human smuggling and human trafficking, but we didn't find many allies to take that further at that time. In a year's time, the House was in a better shape. Accommodation structures and services had been established, and coordination between actors was smoother. Thus, in 2016, anti-trafficking measures in the context of migration management started again to be discussed, and requests from field professionals for training on THP issues increased. Since then, many steps have been taken to respond to the needs of vulnerable populations, including victims of human trafficking and frontline professionals. I will cite some examples. In the context of developing the national referral mechanism, which is now ready and it will be launched next month, we have created specific SOPs for the identification and referral of victims of DHP in the RICs. Specialized training is constantly provided by a variety of factors, including our office, to professionals working at the field, such as medical doctors, cultural mediators, guardian of minors, asylum services workers, etc. In the RICs, safe zones were created for unaccompanied minors and vulnerable women. The vulnerability assessment was revised and unified and is now applied to all migrants and asylum seekers individually, one by one, at the RICs. You can imagine how much time that really takes if you really want to look at that person in the eyes and see whether he's a vulnerable person or, actually, well, to speak better, all of them are vulnerable. They have lost families, they have lost home countries, they have lost everything, yeah? Some of them are more vulnerable and they need immediate support, yeah? So, in order to evaluate which are these people, you have to apply this vulnerability assessment carefully, and looking at their eyes, listening to them, yeah? So this vulnerability assessment is now applied to all migrants and asylum seekers at the RICs. THB indicators have been included in this vulnerability assessment. Existing safe accommodation was reorganized at national level to open up spaces for victims of trafficking. We have started gender mainstreaming work in agencies such as the Asylum Service, the General Hospitals, etc., and many others. However, by attempting to respond to the urgent need of taking care of the most vulnerable among the mixed migration flows and develop anti-trafficking measures specifically adjusted to their situation, other social groups vulnerable to THB may have become temporarily invisible. For example, the Roma population, children in the child protection system, sex workers, economic migrants already in Greece, for example, the victims of the Manalada case, ex-victims of THB in danger to get re-victimized, among others. Europe is challenged by the current migration situation. States are challenged. The development of anti-trafficking measures could not have been an exception. I think we have come out from this 4-year period more experienced, better equipped, and capacitated to identify and protect victims of trafficking and prosecute the traffickers. We try to depict this experience in our new National Action Plan. Our overall aim is to sustain, first of all, existing services and good practices, and then to develop new services, new procedures, new tools, and to further update our legislation. To decide on what it should be sustained, changed, or developed, we have involved in the process of developing the new National Action Plan many and different stakeholders. The new plan is developed around the 4 Ps: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. Each axis will be supported by specific actions. Each action foresees indicators of success. Each axis is gender and age informed and sensitive. We have been really careful in relation to that. I will provide some really simple examples. For example, we have the gender-specific rehabilitation actions have been included in the new National Action Plan. Age-informed training for professionals has been foreseen. Advocacy for gender-sensitive health services, patrolling services, among others, has been planned. Age-sensitive awareness campaigns are organized, etc. Finally, the new National Action Plan has been planned to promote promising practices such as the so-called social path to the identification of victims of trafficking. Also, it is clear through the National Action Plan that the fight against THB is considered in political and operational terms an horizontal issue that traverses several fields of action, such as finance, social and gender equality, education, health, etc. For this reason, many collaborations between different ministries and state and civil society collaborations have been included. Quickly, I'm going to be finishing by describing who are identified as victims of trafficking, where, in which context, and by whom today in Greece. And somehow I'm going to give some insights about the gender issue in THB in Greece today. So, at the hotspots, at the RICS, most women and girls come from Middle East and African countries. At times, families from Afghanistan are also hosted. We have an increase in people coming from Afghanistan after August. Many young boys come from Southeast Asia. Currently, there are around 3,500 unaccompanied minors registered. The number may be larger. Most of them are young boys. Only a few victims of trafficking, however, have been identified in the hotspots. On the other hand, the nationalities of most of the officially identified victims of trafficking, as I said before during the first panel, are different from those nationalities met in the hotspots. Most officially identified victims in Greece are women from Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Russia. Greek women have also been identified. All of them were victims of sexual exploitation. Men were exploited because some men were also identified as victims of trafficking, were exploited in forced labor. Men, women, and children were exploited in forced begging. All officially identified victims were rescued in context other than RICS. The pattern changes if we consider the presumed victims, however, those that have not been officially recognized as victims of trafficking for different reasons. Many of them have been identified in the hotspots or in other refugee accommodations. The great majority is third country nationals. Men and women were equally identified as presumed victims. The larger groups are young boys exploited for forced labor and women and girls suffering from sexual exploitation. The number of presumed victims was the triple from the officially identified victims. So I will close by saying that actually we need a European solution to respond effectively to vulnerable populations, including victims of trafficking. Speaking about the Greek situation, I think I gave you some good data to understand the number of vulnerable people, vulnerable to exploitation, any form of exploitation, residing today in Greece. If we don't manage to find a common solution to that problem, this problem will not be solved. So I'm looking forward to your contributions during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinna, indeed, and for your statement and also showing the deep personal commitment and involvement on your side in overcoming all the challenges you have just described, giving really a very telling picture of the immense task put to Greece, to the government, and to society at large in dealing with the situation. So thank you for that. Before coming to the discussion as such, I would now like to give the floor to our final panelist, Luisa from Germany, working with the German trade unions and a service center for, or against, clearly, labor exploitation, forced labor and human trafficking in Berlin. Luisa, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, first I would also like to give a big thanks to the organizers, to the Austrian Task Force on Combating Human Trafficking, the OSCE, and especially the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, as well as the IOM and the ICMPD, for giving also me the chance to speak to you, because this is in this kind of framework the first time for me. And I would like to give you some examples and some experience from the trade union linked organization I'm working for. It's called Arbeit und Leben, and our focus is forced labor and labor exploitation. First, some information on the role of the German trade unions on labor trafficking. The German trade union involvement is mainly focusing on the enforcement of labor of employment rights for migrants through the work of counseling centers in Germany. But the German Trade Union Confederation was a project partner in various anti-labor trafficking projects since 2009, as well as some single unions, also to mention the police trade union. I'm not going further into details to the projects, but these were also European Social Fund projects who started on a local level in Berlin from 2009 to 2012, but then also in the next episode from 2012 to 2015, where, as I mentioned, the German Trade Union Confederation was involved. Due to the second country visit of the GRETA experts, where Helmut was also present this year, a written comment was formulated by various trade unions and Arbeit und Leben, the organization I'm working for, on specific challenges concerning the implementation of the Council of Europe Convention against trafficking in human beings. What is maybe interesting to mention about that comment is that especially the regional group Customs, which is an undergroup of the police trade union, played an active role in that, in formulating this comment. This is why, because they articulate the view that the financial control of illicit employment, which is a working area of the customs, the German customs, that they play a big role in the detection of labor exploitation, forced labor cases, due to the fact that they are responsible for controlling, for example, minimum wages. So they are on the ground, in the field. They also share the opinion that criminal prosecution of these cases should be also led by the financial control of illicit work. So just to give you an example, that also single trade unions are actively involved so far, but things could be enhanced, to be honest, but just to give you some examples. Now, just some insights about the organization I'm working for, which is a union-linked educational institution that is affiliated to the German Trade Union Confederation and the adult education centers in Germany. It is focusing mainly on educational work related to the topic of work. For example, they are delivering seminars on labor law for work councils or seminars to political participation of marginalized groups. So here is a context, the migration context. Arbeit und Leben is currently maintaining 16 counseling centers in 9 federal states for EU and third country nationals, and they, where these people can seek support in terms of labor and social rights or labor and social questions. When it comes to labor trafficking, Arbeit und Leben is actively involved since 2012 until now by coordinating, I mentioned before, an European Social Fund project against labor trafficking in Germany, and the service center I'm working for. We started our work in August 2017, and it's maybe interesting to mention that our service center is for the first time financed by the Labor Ministry, by the Federal Labor Ministry, which is the first time that the Federal Labor Ministry in Germany is fully financing a project against forced labor. What is the impact and what are the conclusions of these initiatives? We have some figures that show that there is a high request for migrant workers for support in Germany. We have some data collected where we've seen that in 2016 over 9,000 persons sought assistance in Germany. These are estimates. Please take this into consideration. In Berlin, our counseling center where we work with, it's called Counseling Center for Migration and Decent Work. It's also part of Arbeit und Leben, and they estimate a total number of around 5,000 persons who sought assistance this year. Just to have an idea of the amount that is of people who come to seek support in Germany when it comes to labor questions or to social questions. What is the conclusion of these numbers? The financing of the services should be stabilized because they are not up to date, and the cooperation with other actors working in the field of human trafficking should be strengthened. This is crucial since in Germany there's no labor inspection, which is enforcing the employer's right. So because of that fact, I think the work of the trade unions in that context is even more important. Trade unions should put more efforts anyway to organize migrant workers and give them an easy access to trade union membership. This was the first part, giving you some ideas and some insights about our work and the work of trade unions in Germany. But what are the current challenges in Germany? There is one thing that Ms. Schuster already mentioned before, and it is a reform of criminal law provisions in Germany. But before, and I would like to say one thing, in order to convict the perpetrators and to assist the victims, these cases must be recognized as such. This is in first place. This is a big challenge in Germany as well. Therefore, we think that especially law enforcement authorities, police, customs, prosecutors, and judges must be sufficiently trained. This is where we are at the beginning with this topic. So, yeah, the recognition is the first step. Then back to the topic of the criminal law provisions, the new ones in Germany. They have been modified in 2016, almost 2 years ago, as part of the implementation of the EU directive against human trafficking. Forced begging, the removal of organs, and the forced commission of criminal offenses were added to the criminal offenses. They were not part of it before 2016 in Germany. And in addition, there is a new criminal offense of labor exploitation. This paragraph could be a chance for more convictions, since it is not focusing on proving the cause, but the labor exploitation itself. The punishment of the rental of business premises and living spaces is also part of the new criminal offense of labor exploitation and could also give more opportunities for convictions. Nevertheless, law enforcement authorities still see big challenges in the application of these criminal offenses. It's maybe too early to give some detailed insights about the effect of the modified new criminal offenses. For that, the Federal Ministry of Justice is planning a first evaluation on these criminal law provisions after 5 years of implementation, which means in 2021. To that, I would like to add what maybe we do on a small scale with our work. The Service Center is also active on that, and we try to bring prosecutors together who already made experience with the old but also with the new criminal codes. Therefore, we will develop a small workshop by end of the year with prosecutors with the idea to discuss the challenges and chances of these new criminal offenses and exchange experience with investigation and judgments. We do this on a small scale and see, we try to also gather people who are very engaged in being active on the current situation. We are here and we are talking in the framework of the gender dimension, and Helmut already mentioned my point that I would like to stick out a bit. About the sectors of exploitation related to gender dimensions. When it comes to the enforcement of employment rights, the gender aspect is typically not a first priority. The trade union-affiliated counseling centers do rather not focus on the gender distinctions within the sectors, but sometimes sometimes on the countries of origin, since some of them have specific target groups and are financed by this means. If we look at the gender distribution with a focus on investigation procedures of forced labor, the available data shows that there is a bigger percentage of male victims. I give you 2 examples on that. The Federal Situation Service on Human Trafficking of the German Federal Criminal Police indicates in the period between 2015 and 2017 that 70 to 86% of the victims of forced labor were male. A survey that we did in our former project called the Alliance Against Labor Trafficking and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation from 2015, which examined prosecution files of labor trafficking cases in 4 federal states, indicated that even 90% of the victims were male. So, I'm kindly asking you to keep in mind that these statistical data exams are not fully representative, it's just indicating. At the same time, in 2017, only 11 criminal procedures were conducted on forced labor in Germany. When we look at the convictions, we know of the service center, in my person, we know of 12 cases in total since the introduction of the criminal code, criminal offenses in 2005. So this means that victims do not access their rights because they are not identified as such. Often they are even classified as perpetrators, and here we have a big problem in Germany as well, due to their legal status or irregular status. These challenges we see both for men and women, and there's a lot of work to do in Germany on that ground. I would also like to give you some information about the impact of gender on access to services in Germany. Beside the trade union and linked counseling centers that I already mentioned, there are also counseling centers who traditionally work in the context of forced prostitution of women. We call them Fachberatungsstellen in Germany. There are almost 40 of them throughout Germany. They work for a long time and they're very professional and do a really, really important work. But due to funding sources, staff shortages, as well as historical backgrounds of these counseling centers, many of them are currently not able to provide access to male victims when it comes to forced labor cases. Nevertheless, they usually do advise women in case of forced labor or labor exploitation, but the assistance of men is a challenge in that context. There are different concepts and idea of collaboration between the trade union affiliated counseling centers and this counseling centers that I mentioned. One exception in that point is Hamburg. There's a cooperation agreement between a trade union affiliated counseling center from our organization, Arbeit und Leben, and Fachberatungsstelle, and this is in place since 2014. This counseling center does advice on forced labor cases and is including male victims, while the Arbeit und Leben counseling center is assisting people regarding their labor law problems. And this concept might be a solution to better assist the needs of the victims when it comes to forced labor, when we look at the structural situation now. We think that the cooperation between these services is very important, and the service center is also planning joint regional meetings for the advisors of these counseling centers over the next year. The goal is here again to strengthen the cooperation between the services, because we don't have services that fully overlook the whole range of exploitation. So the collaboration in that case is very important. One problem that sticks out from the practical point of view of counseling centers is the accommodation of men. The biggest challenge regarding assistance of men is here the accommodation, because not seldom there are big groups of men who work on the construction sites or in the meat processing industry, and they have to leave the shelter quite quickly when they take action against the employer. In those cases, the accommodation is under the control of the employer, and the counseling center need to respond very quickly to shelter 10, 20, 30 men for the next days or even for the next weeks. And this is a big problem in Germany, because this is regulated by the federal states, by the 16 federal states. And in most of these federal states, there is no solution in place, or available funds, or the funds are too small, or the accommodation offered is not very adequate for the victims. Okay, to finish my input, I would just give you another example of challenges in Germany when it comes to labor courts. As far as I understand, there are no gender-specific challenges when it comes to access to compensation of labor courts, but in Germany, labor courts are accessible by private person even without an advocate, so a private person can access the service even without an advocate. The government doesn't take responsibility to enforce the labor rights of employees, so it's responsible by a private person. Several problems have been detected when it comes to the enforcement of labor standards from the victim's perspective. One thing is that the labor courts are overloaded, so therefore the court cases can take a considerable time, which mostly migrants don't have, due to different reasons. B, usually the employee has a burden of proof, for example, when it comes to the record of working time or the overtime hours. And also point is that the exploited employee carries the financial risk when he loses a trial. So there is a possibility to apply for legal aid, but with restrictions. Due to the mentioned restrictions, migrant workers rather tend to not seek support through labor courts. This is why the trade union counseling centers therefore often find an out-of-court solution for migrant workers who stick into a labor law situation. Lastly, one even bigger challenge are persons without papers, because they have by law the right to claim their loan in front of the labor court, but it is not practicable since labor courts do have a reporting obligation. So no person without a paper would access or take the risk to go to claim his labor rights in front of this court. So at the end, there is no access to compensation for this kind of people without papers. And because I'm very late, I have to shut down here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luisa, and actually apologies to all my panelists for trying to enforce a bit the time limits for the presentation. So now we have heard of so many different aspects. We heard of words that matter, perceptions that matter. We heard that security actually acts against the interests of victims of trafficking. We have heard of the immense challenges in terms also of capacities for the Greek society to deal with different kinds of exploitation, of trafficking, the lack of integrated approaches to address the situation of migrants who might be asylum seekers, who might have been exploited already before or in the country. And we heard of the situation, the challenges in relation to male victims of trafficking for labor exploitation in Germany, considering, for example, on the one hand, the strong presence of NGO services available, but many of them having a history in dealing with women, actually, and yeah, who can actually fill the gap, and to what extent is funding available, actually, to close that gap. So I would skip a question I would have initially prepared for the panelists, but rather would like now to invite you, the audience, to comment, to ask questions on what we heard from the panelists. Because if I may just ask for your understanding, we started some 50 minutes later from the previous panel. So if we can just add perhaps 10 minutes to have at least a chance to get some feedback from your side, if you would agree, that would be great. So now the floor is yours. If you would have questions, comments, please give me a sign and briefly introduce yourself and ask your question. Yes, please. And the second question, perhaps? I think we will only have opportunity for perhaps one round, so perhaps this is already your last chance. So really try to make use of this opportunity. If you want, as a second question, any further comment? Okay, so then let's
I'm
start.
Christiane Upper from Association for Democracy in Africa and African Women Organization. What I hear so much of politics of risk and pity, I somehow miss the politics of respect and responsibility we should also have for trafficked victims. Because in one way or the other, it appears now even ironically, if I see, yeah, we somehow pity ourselves, so many people are coming here and we see the risks in them. But on the other side, what did our governments do that the roots are not fought? We are fighting symptoms, but we are not fighting the roots, what also the Greek panelist was mentioning. So why are the weapons sold like that and there is nothing done? There could be a high tax on weapons, each weapon sold, and that could be used for projects like this. How unequal markets, unequal trade, why can't we not urge our politicians to do something for that? Sit together and fight the roots also in those countries. But we caused a lot of these roots, and now we are having the effects. So we should see it also for that, on that side, and I think really respect and responsibility, they are also very important. They should be employed here.
Thank you. Well taken. The colleague from over there. Yes, please.
Besonders Sie, Frau Bärbel-Heider, haben aus der Seele gesprochen in sehr vielen Bereichen. Ich bin nicht nur wegen diesem Waldviertler Kongress for Progress hier, ich betreue auch in der Öffentlichkeitsarbeit das Projekt Woanders, ein nachhaltiges Projekt, was seit 12 Jahren eben vor Ort mit sehr geringen Mitteln sehr viel geleistet hat, um da wieder die Infrastruktur aufzubauen. Wir haben auch vor Ort Personal ausgebildet, eben damit das nachhaltig funktioniert. Von der Infrastruktur wird es immer besser, aber es dauert halt in solchen Ländern. Und dieses Jahr ist uns etwas passiert, wo ich sage, genau eben durch solche Reden, wie es der Herr Orban schwingt und andere Menschen, die das Ganze politisieren, die diese Menschen als Invasoren bezeichnen, stellt sich für mich die Frage, wie wir gemeinsame Strategien entwickeln können, wie wir dieses erkämpfte Menschenrecht aus dem Industriezeitalter jetzt im Informationszeitalter, dieses auch jetzt nicht hier in diesem elitäreren Rahmen verteidigen können, sondern ganz besonders bei der unteren Bevölkerungsschicht wichtige Aufklärung vollziehen müssen. Weil ich finde globale Lösungen immer sehr wichtig, aber noch wichtiger ist, dass wir die Menschen, die sich noch nicht für dieses Thema Menschenrechte begeistern können, ja, dafür begeistern. Weil es ist oft der einfache Mensch, der das Ganze dann zu stützen hat, aber es nicht versteht, warum er es tun soll. Und da ist für mich die Frage, gibt es eine neuere Idee, um es eben zur Verteidigung, es nicht nur zu erkämpfen?
Okay. Dankeschön. Thank you. A very last chance for a third comment question. Well, it's always a quite difficult situation immediately before the lunch break to ask such questions, but yeah, note taken. So if I may just summarize and actually ask our panelists and perhaps already link these questions you have raised with a kind of a final question I would have, because we heard about the debate focusing only on the symptoms, on the risks, but actually missing the point with the root causes which lead to social inequality, trafficking situations actually. And at the same time, you raised the point of what kind of joint strategies from a grassroots levels could, if I understood you correctly, could be adopted, and what kind of outreach activities would be needed in order to sensitize the general public and to somehow strengthen our own thinking, make it more human rights robust against populistic attitudes. So I would like to pose these two questions on the root causes and the grassroots to the colleagues at the panel, and linking this to the final remark from my side, what would you consider also from your own personal experience as the most important lesson learned in order to make anti-trafficking human rights defenders possible in our countries? From the human rights field, we always speak of human rights defenders to ensure access to rights, or at least to support victims to get access to rights and remedies. Why not speak of anti-trafficking human rights defenders? So, linked to this, Bärbel, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much. Maybe to start with the last question. First of all, only national states can guarantee human rights, which also makes this paradox clear that this is actually what Hannah Arendt pointed out. What if people are stateless and national states actually don't care about them and don't consider them as people to be protected? So what then the civil society can do is to constantly remind governments of their international treaties they signed and their obligation they have. I think what's also even more important is not to normalize these shifts that we all observe in each country in Europe currently, and the shifts against in language, but also in programs that we do not talk about human rights language even anymore, that we have a European Council conclusion document that doesn't even have the word migrant in it anymore, which was impossible, unimaginable 10 years ago. But now it's concluded, and I haven't heard hardly anyone from the civil society actually to protest against it. So what we have to be very, very careful not to normalize this kind of shift in human rights protection. And secondly, and this is the question from the lady from over there, yes, I totally agree. Root cause is extremely important to tackle. However, when we talk about trafficking in human beings here in Europe, here in Austria, or in Europe in general, this is just like a very small element of a huge dynamic process and of a huge complex system, and we have to understand the entire system. And we cannot talk about only how to prevent trafficking and how to prosecute trafficking if we just look through the trafficking glasses, so to say. We really have to widen the anti-trafficking conversation also to talk about global justice, to talk about global economic fair trade programs, etc., etc. This is also part of prevention of trafficking, and I also really disagree with what has been said in the first panel in the morning that, oh no, we cannot talk about migration or we cannot talk about smuggling because we are talking about trafficking. It doesn't work like this in reality. I mean, it's very nice that we have different international legal instruments and a protocol on smuggling, a protocol on trafficking. We have the Migrant Rights, Workers' Rights Convention that is not enforced, unfortunately, because it was not supported by international community. But reality is something else. Reality doesn't stick to the legal categorization we invented. And we have to look into the entire picture. And of course, we have to look at the situation of migrants in Europe when we talk about trafficking. Of course, we have to look at economic, at fair trade and economic justice worldwide. When we talk about trafficking, preventing trafficking in Europe, we have to keep in mind all these bigger pictures. Otherwise, we get just in a kind of neoliberal management mode and in a kind of governance mode that is totally apolitical. And this is what we should not normalize at civil society and also not as an academic community.
First of all, I will make Pavel's words mine as well, and I perfectly agree. About the root causes, I think I spoke up a little bit about exploitation and root causes in the beginning of my talk, so I'm not going to go back there because I think I gave an idea of what I believe in relation to that bit. However, I think we have to strengthen collaboration with countries of origin, with migrant communities already living in Europe, and they can help us a lot to support vulnerable newcomers, etc. So I think that's a couple of strategies that they could help with dealing with the root causes. Now, I would like to underline that what we try to do in Greece in order to address the root cause as well is to include human rights education and reproductive health in schools to all levels of public education, starting from nurseries. As a psychologist, I can tell you that young children, they start perceiving the differences between people after when they are 3 or 4, they already have words about it. So that's a good age to start talking to them about not the bad thing of being different, but how many similarities we've got, while at the same time we are so interesting people being different one from another. So we try to promote and advocate for human rights in education in Greece, and we will try to tackle the root causes through that. At the same time, what do we do in order to tackle the root causes and also to use the knowledge of the grassroots associations and civil society? We have mapped, in the process of developing the national referral mechanism, we have mapped society, civil and NGO society associations providing outreach activities and community activities, etc. We have mapped everything, and we have tried to include what is already there, what is already sustained by the community in the national referral mechanism. So in that way, we think that the NRM is going to be sustainable. and at the same time, the NRM is gonna be of, it's gonna belong to everybody. Everybody will support it because the NRM is based on what the civil society and the grassroots organizations, as well as the state and NGOs, had thought of being useful and effective. So in this process of creating the NRM, we have mapped the reality and we have built our NRM based on the existing reality, trying to create some bridges, to bridge the gaps. Yeah? So that's also an indirect response to strategies in relation to grassroots activities, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's on? Yes. Okay. Just to add two things that I think it's also important. It's the society behavior of in that context, especially when it comes to labor exploitation. We see that in Germany there's not a big awareness in the public about people who work in the meat processing industry, people who work on the construction site who are from Romania or from Bulgaria, and maybe which effect it has to our consumer behavior. And I think this is something that we have to address on a larger scale, because people think this is like very far away from my life, but it's actually quite close. So as you said before, broaden up this topic and the challenges for people in our society, in this case in the German society, and Germany is a country of destination, it's a very, very important thing that we are not doing sufficiently so far. That's one thing. And it's also what I try to explain you from the labor market perspective is that we already now see like it's a two-class labor market, if not a three-class labor market. This cannot be the right way for a democratic direction and for a country being part of the European Union who is, as we say, defending human rights on the paper. But I think this is very, very important to prevent this two, three-class labor markets where migrants and third country nationals are the losers or at the ladder of the scale. And this is why we should at least, I can say it from Germany, take care about certain migration policies or labor policies that we put in place and rethink these policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, actually, to everyone in the room, and I think this brings us to an end for this panel. I think the panel made clear the many phases, the complexities of trafficking, that we need to have a thorough understanding also of the gender dimension, how it works, both the mechanisms for getting persons into dependency and making them vulnerable to exploitation, and also for the understanding of what would be appropriate responses to them, that we get away from the current trend, perhaps to human rights rhetoric, as it was called. Perhaps we might call it even the trivialization of human rights, to really get against the normalization of challenging fundamental human rights norms, and to and finally also to think about working together in terms of integrated responses, not to make trafficking an isolated phenomenon which is also combated in isolation. Finally, perhaps also to oppose any efforts to criminalize migrants, also through the anti-trafficking discourse, just to the opposite, to actually counter it, strengthen the human rights defenders who are entirely and tirelessly, so that's the right word, tirelessly working actually to support the victims across Europe and across the region. And yeah, just to say, in 4 years' time, we will have the findings from GRETA, on the experiences how access to justice is actually ensured among member states for the Council of Europe Convention. So I'm sure we will be happy to share the findings with you in another event, but for the time now, thank you again. Thank you to the organizers, IOM and VIDC, and enjoy lunch.